Leslie, thank you so much. Ron, alcoholic, and that's probably the most important part of the introduction, isn't it? After all that glowing stuff, I'm a drunk who, at a time that I remember still too well, would drink too much and lose control of bodily functions. Let's just be honest. I'm not here out of virtue. I'm here out of train wrecking my life. But I'm here to talk about emotional sobriety. As Leslie said, this is the second of 5 sessions. The first one in December was about expectations inventory, which before we're done, we'll post the link to that so you all can go back and look at it if you like. Expectations inventory, as at its heart, says that if we're experiencing a resentment, a frustration, a disappointment, the thing to do is to look at what expectations we bring to that situation and explore that in the spirit of a fourth step. Tonight, we're actually going to look at the fourth and fifth step, very specifically a progressive approach to the fourth and fifth step. Now, first, let me tell you, my sober date is December 28th, 1985. I got sober in Albany, New York, and then spent a whole bunch of time in Albuquerque, New Mexico, before I ended up out here in Greenville and now in Atlanta. So I need to say a word about how the fourth and fifth step fits into the steps. I know that most of us view the steps through a certain lens that has been brought to us, but I think of them differently. And for tonight, I'm going to share very briefly how the steps are designed to work. If you were here before, we were chit-chatting a little bit about step zero. Step zero is this shit's got to stop. We get stuck, we're suffering. The guy who taught that to me many years ago said you can't get to a step one without first getting to a step zero. So after step zero, we've got the first step. Everybody knows it. It basically says you're screwed. That's exactly how my first sponsor explained it. Let's set aside all the highfalutin language. Let's just admit you're screwed. You're powerless and your life has become unmanageable. Steps 2 and 3 are about power. People like to call them the God steps. I don't particularly care what anybody calls them. What they say is there is power. Steps 4 and 5 are about unblocking that power to work in and through our lives. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a moment because it's important to explain why I frame it that way. 6 and 7 are about asking for help for the removal of those blockages so we can be restored. 8 and 9 are participating in the remaking of our lives through that power. 10 is a monitoring step where we continue to watch. 11 is the conscious contact step, trying to contact that higher power. And 12, of course, is practicing these principles in all our affairs. So let me go back to the way I framed the fourth and fifth step. Let's be honest, most of us believe or were taught that steps 4 and 5 are an attempt to identify what a lousy, rotten, terrible human being I am and to document all the proof of just how rotten I am. I understand that. My first couple of fourth steps were exactly that, looking to find exactly what was wrong with me through looking at my behavior. But in 1957, Bill Wilson wrote a most profound letter that asked or said this. He said, the purpose of the moral inventory, that's step 4, is to discover how we were damaged by life. So I'm going to repeat that. The purpose of the moral inventory, counter to our belief that we're supposed to identify all the things we did that are awful, the purpose of the moral inventory is to understand how we were damaged by life. That is a profoundly different approach. So I'm not looking for what a bad human being I am. Now, most of us start our first fourth step that way, but eventually what we're being encouraged to do is to bring it around so that we are in fact focused on how we were damaged. That's a different kind of inventory. So before I jump into that and ask you to put a few things in the chat box, what the big book, sort of our basic text, says is that the purpose of the fourth and fifth step is to get down to causes and conditions, the things that produce these behaviors which are so problematic, including drinking, drugging, and you name your addiction. I'm sure it's well represented by all of us in here. So we're looking for causes and conditions. And then it goes so far as to say that alcohol is but a symptom. So we're looking for the causes and conditions of a symptom called alcoholism, or the drinking of excessive amounts of alcohol. What I'd love for you all to do is to use the chat box now. And I'd like you to just honestly make an assessment of where you are with regard to a fourth step. Are you done forever because you're one and done? Do you hate the fourth step and you're never going to do one? Are you in the middle of one? Have you done dozens of them? Do you like the fourth step? Are you annoyed at the proposition that we're even going to talk about the fourth step? Tell the truth about where you are using the chat box, because there is power in telling the truth about ourselves. So where are you? You don't have to write a long text. Just put something in the chat box about where you are with regard to your fourth step. Constantly being damaged by life. Just did it one time. In the middle of working one now, and it's painful. I'm procrastinating. That's a common story. I'm in the middle of a fourth step. I've gone over the first 5 resentments with my sponsor. You've done 3. I'm just getting started with my sponsor and I'm dreading it a bit. Some of us dread it a lot. I've been unable to get past trying to start it. That's a fairly common story. Done it multiple use on a daily basis. Yep. That's kind of like what I do with the 10th step. I've done one. Some things I will tell again. Some things I won't. In the middle of one, a fear inventory. Okay. This is all great because wherever you are is wherever you are. It's useful to tell the truth. As for me, just to participate in the spirit of telling the truth, here's a few more. Haven't got there. Completed a thorough one. Haven't completed a thorough one. Several short ones. New resentments because my dad died. I've done 3 formal fourth steps. In the middle of one. I've done 2 and to no avail. I'm doing a fear inventory now. I've done a few, but need to revisit it. Done it many times. Don't like it. That's truth telling. I'm due for a new one. Okay, but I don't feel like I have the rapport with my sponsor that I need. Okay. All right. So as I said, most of us, our first time through, the fourth step is painful, very painful, because we're telling the truth about our bad behavior. Well, the point is to move beyond bad behavior and look at the root causes, the causes and conditions that produce this disease called alcoholism. And for many of us, what we're going to find is that it takes us into relational inventory, because as one of the promotional items said, I heard this in the rooms one time, if you squeeze any alcoholic hard enough, a codependent pops out. And I learned this because 2 really important transitions in my recovery were at 12 years sober and at 17 years sober. Yes, a program is supposed to bring you new things to work on. We get stuck. That's what happens with step work. So I got stuck, and at 12 years sober, 7 years into my second marriage and suffering profoundly, I realized I needed to do something different because doing what I'd been doing was just producing suffering. Bad outcome. So I did a whole different kind of inventory, which is what I'm going to teach you a little bit about here tonight, about what I've been taught and learned. And that changed everything. It changed my relationship to the fourth step. It changed my relationship to my wife, who is now my ex-wife, because that inventory brought about an amend called divorce. I know that's not a common way to talk about it, but it was the amend. It also brought about an amend of keeping my stepdaughters in my life to this day, 30 years later, despite getting done with their mom. That was part of the amend as well. And then at 17 years sober, after I was sure I had learned all those relational inventory issues, I ended up in inpatient treatment at a place that was specializing in people with alcohol and drug problems who have discovered that they're codependent and love addicted. And it turns out that long before I found alcohol, I was a love addict and a codependent. And that The source of much of what I struggled with, contrary to popular belief of what I'd been told, actually did come from my family of origin and my early life experiences. So let me take a step back for a moment. I know we've all been told it's not your mama's fault. Well, I'm not blaming my mom personally, but I do understand where these things came from now, and they come out of family of origin. That's why so much of the recovery work we do at a place like Pavillon and in a lot of recovery work goes back to look at how we got formed, how we got damaged by life. The other thing I want to repeat is that the purpose of the steps is to over and over again get us cornered so we can take the next giant step forward. So getting stuck is a normal, healthy part of recovery. Getting unstuck is a whole nother proposition. So, what I have learned to accept about myself is that beneath every inventory is another inventory in the making. And I will never be done, not if I'm going to be restored. And I think that's the progressive promise of the second step, a continuing restoration. So, the first thing is we're going to have to go back and look at the first 7 years of life. Here's why. Here's what the research shows. The research, now I'm going to get geeky on you. The research shows that in the first 7 years of life, who we are gets fully formed. It's influenced by nature and nurture, our genes and our caregivers. And if they give us nurturance, we turn out just an ordinary troubled human being. If they don't nurture us, we end up damaged pretty badly in some cases. And that's the thing that so many of us are not wanting to look at. My particular defense mechanism was to insist that my family was perfectly normal and it was all just fine, right up until the moment that the therapist poked me for about the 37th time. And suddenly I busted wide open and found out I'd been protecting the deepest wound inside of me that I'd never known about. That happened at 17 years sober, working a program of recovery, doing the steps, sponsoring, being sponsored, going to meetings, making coffee, doing service work. And it took 17 years for me to finally get at what I believe to be the root causes. My sponsor at the time, I was very embarrassed to admit it had taken me 17 years to get to this inventory. And his comment was, well, Ron, you wouldn't want to rush these things now, would you? So he understood that we get to it when we get to it. So let me tell you the other piece you need to understand about causes and conditions. Here's what you need to know about you. You have beliefs and perceptions. They might be accurate, they might be completely off the mark. You got them because you're human, some strange mix of your experiences in your life. I'll share an experience, a guide to some inventory work here in just a moment to explain how that can come together. And those experiences that we had that formed these, big book calls it old ideas and decisions based on self, those cause us to interpret our experience in the world. What's happening in the world is oftentimes not really what's happening in the world, it's our interpretation of the world. We are interpreters, we are storytellers, we tell ourselves stories. They might be true, they're often false. In the handout I'll give you at the end, I'll include a link to go to an hour-long workshop I did just on this part of what's underlying it all. So we have beliefs and perceptions, we encounter the world, we interpret the world, that interpretation produces feelings, and we act based on feelings. So in reverse, my action, when I first inventoried that I was a jerk, that's fine, that's a starting point. I act like a jerk because of some feelings I had. Those feelings were produced by what I was interpreting in the world. What happened in the world was being interpreted by how I believed and saw the world. So how I believe influences how I experience the world. How I experience the world produces feelings because I tell myself a story. Those feelings cause action. So the purpose of the fourth step is to get all the way back to the stuff that produces the actions that we can see evidence of, which sounds unpleasant, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it's remarkable. So I want to tell you a story about me that is embarrassing, but all the more reason to tell it. When I was in ways in recovery, I started having memories flash back of a hand coming around a door. And I didn't know whose hand it was, and I didn't know where the door was. All I know was it was a sexually charged image. That's all I knew for sure. And as I meditated on it and did my work around, I was working with a therapist too. What kept coming to my memory was a very buxom, blonde headed woman next door, and that I was about 5 years old at the time. And my immediate conclusion was that I had been perpetrated by this blonde, buxom woman next door. But we worked more deeply, my sponsor and my therapist. And eventually, what we found out was that hand was my mother's hand coming around the door, that I had barricaded the door. I had barricaded it with a dresser of drawers because I was in the room with the little girl from next door named Teresa, who was blonde, but not the blonde, buxom mom. And we were playing doctor, and I was 5 years old. And I got caught. And I asked my mom, this was before she passed, what happened? This has profoundly affected me. And she goes, oh, honey, I had no idea what to do with that. I was so embarrassed and ashamed, I did never say anything. Well, see, I knew that if you did something bad, you got spanked. Shame cascaded upon me, and my interpretation at 5 years old was that what I did was so wrong and so shameful that we didn't even talk about it. So fast forward, I'm an adult male, apparently healthy in a lot of ways. I'm sober, and I'm having all these difficulties with sexual relations with the women in my life. Wives, it didn't matter. And I did the inventory, and it turns out that I drank to have sex because I was too deeply troubled and embarrassed and ashamed about sex to be able to have sex healthily with a woman, even sober, especially sober, because of how I was interpreting the experience. So this innocent misinterpretation as a 5-year-old was undermining my sexual adult life because of a misinterpretation. That's an old idea. And until I got done with that, I was not capable of healthy sexual relationships with women. It's embarrassing to admit that I found that when I was well into my adulthood, well into sobriety, well into recovery. So a cause and condition of my sexual challenges wasn't about sex. It was about the shame a little boy took on when he was just a little boy. That's a whole different inventory. That's how I was damaged by life. And nobody's to blame. It's my old idea. I had to do the work on that. So it's just an example. I share that really embarrassing one so that you all can, know that you're not alone with whatever challenges you faced relationally. So let me then talk about the fourth step now. You all know the structure, or presumably you do, in the big book. Column 1, who or what. Column 2 of the inventory is the story, what happened. Column 3 is how it affects us. Column 4 is often called our part. Well, I'm not happy to call it our part. I like to talk about what we bring to it. So for example, my part in the sexual difficulties as an adult male was that I had a story I was telling myself that brought deep shame into my adult life, making it impossible or difficult to practice perfectly healthy sexual expressions without drinking. No wonder I drank to be in relationship. It makes perfectly good sense, doesn't it? So column 1, 2, 3, 4, we're going to do a deeper dive into column 4. What I want to do with this is use an example in my book, which I know Leslie will say something about on the back end, Progressive Recovery Through the 12 Steps, Emotionally Sober for Life. It's in the handout I'll give you too, if you're interested. But the handout contains this part of the inventory. First, I'm going to do it for a female because I've done a lot of this recovery work. I'm also a social worker, so I kind of cross all the boundaries all the time. Not inappropriately, of course. so it's yeah. Well, I just blushed. That was embarrassing. Okay, so there you go. So I'm going to do first from a woman whose name is Jennifer, and she's a composite of a number of women that I've talked through the steps. I'm going to flip it and I'm talking about a guy. What a guy oftentimes run into. So column 1 of Jennifer is she has a problem with men. Starts with one man, then she inventories. Turns out there's all these men in her life that she's had problems with. And the story basically is column 2 is their unavailability, the difficulty of having intimacy with them, all the disconnections, the broken relationships, even in sobriety, which is a fairly common story. Some of you know that we find out all kinds of relational problems when we're not drinking and drugging. Column 3 then is how I'm affected. And in Jennifer's case, again, a composite, she's ashamed, she's embarrassed, she's frustrated, she's exasperated. She can't figure out why she can't find a healthy relationship with a man. Well, column 4, when she starts her part in this, what she brings to it, Jennifer's starting point is, well, I'm just a bitch. The reason these relationships, I'm just a bitch. Can you hear that? That's the judgmental symptom. I'm a bitch. That's why these relationships don't work. Well, with support of a therapist and a sponsor, digs a little more deeply. What Jennifer begins to find is that in her history, there were no stable male relationships, not with her father, not with multiple stepfathers. Some were mildly abusive, some were badly abusive. So her entire life history, dating all the way back to as early as Jennifer can remember, is of unavailable men who will mistreat her, except if she does things to earn their favor. So she figures out that the way to get men to pay attention to her is to act in ways that bring favor. Now, that can be everything from becoming the wage earner, taking care of the guy, meeting his emotional needs, meeting his sexual needs, compromising yourself. Just being really honest, I'm told from a lot of the women that I have very close relationships with in recovery that deep sexual shame around abasing oneself is a fairly common story for a lot of women in recovery. That women drinking do lots of things they're not happy about when they get sober. It's deep shame. My sponsor, longtime sponsor, said that he believed that most of us, if we go back out and get loaded, it's because of unresolved sexual shame. That quite often we have difficulties there. So anyway, there's this whole story that Jennifer has of unavailable men. She has to do things for their favor, dating all the way back to daddy, who abandoned her anyway. And what Jennifer eventually finds is that she is basically pretty sure, A, that men are completely unavailable no matter what she does. B, that there is something fundamentally flawed with her, that she is not lovable. And that as a result of that, she must do something to gain lovability. So she must act in ways that will get and hold their attention, except it never works. And worse still, it becomes a downward spiral of behavior. So what we're looking at is a behavior, but we're trying to look much more deeply into the root causes. So my part, what I'm bringing to this, if I'm Jennifer, is that I believe men are unavailable, fundamentally unavailable. There are no available men in the world, which, by the way, is not true, but that's her experience. It was lived experience. And that the reason they're unavailable is there's something tragically wrong with her. She's not lovable. She's broken. She's unacceptable. She's damaged goods. That's one that comes up often for women, I'm told, and I've had that experience of talking to them. So her conclusion is that the only way to have a relationship is to do things that will please the guy so that the guy will stick around and pay attention to her and meet her needs. That's her part. That's what she brings to this. It's not that she's a bitch. She's behaving like a bitch, if that's even accurate, because of this terrible pattern of emotional, psychological, relational damage and breakdown that happens over and over again. Now, before we're done, I'll come around and talk about where this takes us to. So now we've got men in general, particular men, stories of unavailability, difficulty, abuse, neglect, abandonment, betrayal, how it makes her feel degraded, frustrated, angry, upset, all kinds of words there. Her part, well, she thought it was because she was a bitch. Actually, what she found out was that it turns out that her underlying problem is that she believes that men aren't available. that there's something wrong with her, profoundly wrong with her, and that she must do things to get their attention. So that's a different column 4. And the damaged by life part dates back across a lifetime, all the way back to daddy and multiple stepdads, who are all kinds of guys. So that's a female progressive inventory looking more deeply. So what we find then is we don't go to step 7 and say, higher power, please help me to stop being a bitch. That is not the 7th step. The 7th step is, higher power, I am going to need some serious help with my belief system, my old ideas, my decisions based on self that are so much a part of me that I don't know how to be someone else. Higher power, I don't know how to not believe that men are unavailable. I don't know how to stop believing that I'm damaged goods. I don't, for the life of me, have any other tools in my toolkit other than doing things to try and get men to pay attention to me. I need some serious spiritual help, higher power. Now, let's do this for a guy. Let's just be completely gender fair here. I'm a guy, so I can do this probably with even more credibility. We do have to remember Bill, the sections in the big book that Bill wrote, that women wrote, were actually Bill writing. So there's a long history in AA of men speaking for women, which we'll talk about that on another workshop. I fully own that. So it's not uncommon for men to have a comparable story. See, my column 2 and your column 4 fit together hand in glove. Guy, Donna, Barbara, Jill, Julie, Angela. Column 2, her part, she is such a bitch. Can you hear it? Her column 4 is his column 2. She is such a bitch, which is not true. Column 3, it makes me angry. I lash out. I punish her. Sometimes I even hit her. I certainly abuse her. I distance from her because I can't stand her when she's bitching at me. Okay, column 4 for the guy. What's wrong here? What are you bringing to this? Well, obviously, I'm just an asshole. The asshole statement is comparable to Jennifer calling herself a bitch. It is a symptom. So if we look beneath that, beneath the guy saying he's an asshole, and he is behaving that way, we're going to find perhaps something like this. Let's call our guy Bob. So Bob takes a good look at this, and Bob realizes that what's underneath that is the fact he behaves badly because he feels like he's failing her. He feels like he's failing her because he hears all the time about how he's failing her. And he begins to look back, and maybe he finds out that long, long, long ago, his mother called him a nasty little boy. That's a true story. Or tells him he's worthless. In another variation on the theme, this comes from a guy I'll call Scott. Scott was told when his daddy died at 13 by all his uncles that he needed to stand up and be a man now and take care of mommy and his sisters. And he ended up compromising his life for them. Compromising his life in a very big way, about which he had a deep resentment because he didn't go to college, which is what he wanted to do, and he didn't finish his he had an athletic scholarship, but he had to take care of mom. Well, his history after that is of alcoholism and drug addiction, because he's living a compromised life because he believes that his whole purpose in life is to take care of a woman who can't take care of herself. So now we're all the way down in his column 4, what he brings to this. On the flip side of Jennifer, we've got this guy. Jennifer is saying, I need you to be available. He's thinking, I'm a failure, I'm a failure, I'm a failure, I'm a failure. Why do I have to be responsible for her happiness? I'm such a jerk. If I was a stand-up guy, I would actually respond to this well, but she's such a bitch. Can you hear the cycle? It goes round and round and round, and it's a perfect dovetail. And until Jennifer understands where hers is coming from, and until Bob figures out where his is coming from, there is no relational solution. And we can go through variation after variation after variation. I will share one more very briefly. It's one of the more profound ones I ran into working with a guy who had a profound fear of abandonment. Big, tall, strong guy named Chuck. It's a fictional name. And turns out that Chuck's story was he was given up for adoption. His mama didn't want him. And he ended up spending 3 months in the incubator with nobody touching him. Well, that's a profound kind of abandonment for a baby. And he got adopted into a family, and there was stuff there. But anyway, his whole story started because it turns out his mama gave him up because she loved him and knew she couldn't take care of him. But he experienced profound abandonment, which he then brought forward across his lifetime. That's how he was damaged by life. Those well-meaning uncles for Bob thought they were doing him a favor, telling him to be responsible for his mom and for his kids, for his sisters. But he internalized it ultimately as being a terrible price to have to pay and a lifetime responsibility for taking care of women. And all these people were well-meaning. They didn't intend to damage us, and yet we got damaged, so it's our inventory. So column 4 is looking much more deeply into understanding what the Big Book actually calls causes and conditions that produce the symptom of alcoholism. It encourages us to look at our old ideas and our decisions based on self. So going back to the way we operate, you and I are walking the world with unexamined old ideas and decisions based on self. They may or may not be accurate. We encounter the world. We interpret the world because of our old ideas and decisions based on self. Oftentimes, our interpretation is flat out wrong. Chuck's interpretation that he had been abandoned actually was an interpretation of a mother giving him up out of love, not out of abandonment. But that was not what he experienced. His real experience was abandonment. He didn't know any better. He was only a newborn. So anyway, we've got old ideas, decisions based on self. We encounter the world. We interpret the world. It produces feelings in us. Those feelings cause us to act. And most of us don't ever get past the acting in column 4. We don't get past saying, I'm a bitch or I'm an asshole. Those are symptoms. What we want to do is look more deeply. Now, probably you're saying to yourself, I'm probably going to need some help with this, to which I say, yes. Yeah, you're going to need a sponsor who knows how to do some serious inventory work, and you're probably going to need a therapist who knows how to help you work on this deep healing work. The language for this, there's a chapter in the book about this, about trauma. Many of us are carrying trauma that has been unresolved, and our much of the pain we have around inventory is because we're running into the trauma. It's unresolved, it's unaddressed, it's shadow. And so we're probably gonna need therapy. Many of us are gonna need therapeutic help. Just for the record here, let's be really honest. I'm 35 years sober and I have 20 years of therapy under my belt. So, I mean, let's be honest, I needed a whole lot of help to do this. And I have had a succession of really good spiritual advisors. So I got a triad. I got a sponsor, I got a therapist, and I got a spiritual advisor, all 3 of whom work with me to do this deeper work. So then what happens? Well, I want to reframe it again. 6 and 7 isn't about not being a bitch or not being an asshole. 6 and 7 is about a deep healing of the broken beliefs we have deep in our being. Stuff we didn't even know we were carrying around. Stuff that may explain patterns in our lives across relationships. We need help because, as my sponsor said, that stuff runs through us like the stain runs through marble. It's part of our being. We need serious spiritual help, hence 6 and 7. I suppose it's fine to pray not to be a bitch or to pray not to be an asshole, but the evidence seems to suggest that until we get to the causes, it doesn't really resolve. 8 and 9 is about making amends. And there's a great story in the book about Jennifer, and I could do this too, but I'm watching the time. I want to have time for questions and answer too. 8 and 9 amends isn't just apologizing and trying not to be a bitch or an asshole. The ultimate amend is that deep healing. So Jennifer no longer believes that she is unlovable. That's the amend. The remaking, the changing of one's very being. The remaking for Bob is to give him some relief from thinking he is fully responsible for those women. And of course, whatever came with the damage of his mom, his dad dying when he was little as well, and the sacrifices he had to make. So 8 and 9, the amends for a progressive inventory look very, very different. That doesn't mean we don't fix our misbehavior. Of course we do. But what we really need is an amending of what we hold inside us, deep within us. Step 10 then becomes a monitoring step. Continue to watch. So if I'm Jennifer, continue to watch for the thought that I'm not adequate. Continue to watch for guys who aren't available. Continue to watch for the actions I take trying to earn love. If I'm Bob, the monitoring intent step is I continue to watch for thinking I'm responsible for someone, which is codependency recovery. Continue to watch for thinking that I'm worthless. So remember, the 10th step says continue to watch for X. When we see it, we ask God to remove it at once. That throws us back into 6 and 7. We tell another human being about it. 8 and 9 then is we make it right, except the making right is inside where the damage is, because heal the damage and the exterior begins to fall into place. So here's the really cool part. When I first started doing this kind of inventory, I was pretty sure that I had 9,000 some defects called old ideas. It turns out, and there's some really, really cool stuff on this from Carl Jung, who was really integral in helping AA come into being with his feedback on psychic change and so forth. Carl Jung, quite a luminary, says that most of us have a core complex. So what that means in Jennifer's case, if she can get this healed, this deep sense of her inadequacy, this need to earn, some large percentage of my problems will begin to resolve, because they're like this. They're like a ganglion. There's a core down in there and all these symptoms. So by not going more deeply, what we're doing is we're just looking at all these symptoms, all these behaviors, all these misbehaviors, all these conduct issues, when in fact, what we're being encouraged to do is to find the piece that binds it all together. And I have found in most cases, for most of us, with having done this with myself and a lot of people, it's one or two. I've met a couple people with 3 really, really entrenched old ideas, but there's not much. So that's really encouraging. So before we go to Q&A, let me be really encouraging. Today, what I call emotional sobriety, which is what Bill called it when he wrote The Next Frontier back in 1957, the same time he was writing that language about being damaged by life. What emotional sobriety is for me today, and can be for you, is that I no longer walk the world thinking that you have anything to do with my well-being, my happiness, or my contentment. I am not dependent on you or the world to make me okay. My okay is 100% inside. And when I bump into you, when one of you does something, whatever it is you do, because I have lots of inventory material every single day. I'm not free of inventory. Every time I bump into you, it's a wake-up reminder. There I go again, higher power. There I go again, thinking that I've failed them, which is part of my old idea structure. Thinking that I have fallen short, thinking that I'm not adequate. Please take this from me. And I do that over and over again when I have to. But most days now are spent with very little conflict with you people. Most days are spent with very little conflict with life. When I first started this inventory, the word that most described me was discontented. I was pretty much discontented all the time about most everything. I could not be content with where I was. I spend most of my time contented today. The most miraculous thing about this way of thinking about the inventory is that when higher power, whatever it may be, finally begins to address the way you were damaged and you begin to be healed, then not only does all of your life begin to sort itself back out and line up, but you start having a completely different interpretation of the world. Because my old ideas have been altered, I no longer interpret the world the way I used to, which means it doesn't produce the feelings it used to produce, which means I no longer act in the ways that were destructive, harmful, and problematic. I didn't get there by fixing the behavior, though I worked hard on behavior. I got there by going back and working on this stuff that is deep down inside me. So one last word, and then we'll see what questions people have. If you're judging yourself, it's not a moral inventory. There is no room in the inventory for fault finding. Fact finding, yes. Fault finding, no. What I have learned about all of you through working with the Bobs and the Jennifers and the Chucks and cleaning up my own affairs is every one of you is just as innocent as you can be. I got tears. This is what emotional sobriety has taught me. Every one of you is just as innocent as you can be. That doesn't mean you're not drinking or drugging or causing mayhem. It means that you're innocent. And with innocence comes the unreserved statement that I love you and that you are lovable, just like you are, even with bad behavior. Because the only thing that will heal these deep wounds is to stop punishing ourselves and to stop letting others punish us. Somebody's got to put their arms around us and say, I love you and you're okay. You're a pretty cool kid. Which sounds like inner child work if you're familiar with that. And it is inner child work stolen from ACA. So I want to close on that. What this deeper fourth step work has done is it's finally brought me to a place where I really get it, that I'm a pretty cool, innocent kid sitting on the curb having the time of my life. And whenever I mess up, it's a reminder that I've forgotten my innocence. I've forgotten. And I use the steps to wake me back up.